Pledge of Allegiance, and so I'm thinking maybe your group may want to come to the podium and use the microphone and start the Pledge of Allegiance. Does that work for you guys? All right.
So while they're lining up, I'll introduce our Girl Scout Daisies, Troop 447. They are kindergartners and first graders. And I think all but one live in West Sacramento, and I think almost all of them go to school in West Sac. So girls, before we do the pledge, I'd like you to come up to the microphone and say what your name is.
Zen.
Whose mom is she? Hers.
Ellie. Kaylin. Ella. Brendan.
It's an honorary Girl Scout.
Oh, I don't know.
Camille.
So you guys want to line up here? You guys can line up right here. Hey, Sandy, come here. Sandy, come here. Come here. Stand up right here. Do you want to start? Does someone else want to start the pledge?
All right. So now we got the big screen up there. So
Look at this. Oh my goodness. They can see that on TV, guys.
that's okay. That happened to us the first time we saw ourselves on the big screen too. So
Why is
all
my
right.
head so shiny?
So do we want to start the Pledge of Allegiance? We'll all stand up, and then you guys, whenever you're ready, you start the pledge. Okay?
Right here, honey. And how do you start?
Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America
And
to the republic from which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Right. Very good. Thank you very much.
And then I'll introduce our troop leader, Julie, who might have a couple of words. Thank you.
Good evening, Yolo Port Commission. I just wanted to thank you so much for hosting the Girl Scout Daisy Troop 447, and we just have a little token of our appreciation, thanking the City Hall, West Sacramento City Hall, for all that you do and for hosting us tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you for coming. And we know that the troop had an opportunity with President Sandine. I think she's now been dubbed the president. Is that right, by your troop earlier this evening? So she had a chance to tour City Hall with the troop. So thank you very much. Hopefully you guys learned something today. So thank you.
Say thank you.
Thank you.
All right. All right, so item one is presentations by the public on matters not on the agenda but within our jurisdiction. I don't have any slips to speak, and I don't see anybody that's here that's raising their hand to speak on item one. So we'll move to item two, which is consideration of approval of the April 6th Port Commission meeting minutes.
So moved.
A motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
The motion carries unanimously. That moves us to our regular agenda. Item three is presentation of the port budget. Mr. Laurel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So tonight we're a little early this year, given that it's only May 4th, but we wanted to get the budget to the Port Commission since it's ready to go. So the presentation we're going to do tonight is very similar to what you've seen in the last couple of years, similar format, just to keep it consistent. The staff report was essentially done in the same fashion. So we're going to start by a little bit of review of fiscal year 15-16 budgetary performance, but also some of the highlights, and then go into the proposed budget for the coming fiscal year. So in 15-16, it was another good year for the port overall, both from a financial perspective, but also more of the some of the highlights you see on these couple of slides. So it was the third year of the master lease since we did the business plan. SSA, by all accounts, is still earning a profit on their side of the lease. There have been lower rice volumes due to both the drought and also competition from Stockton and other ports, but they've been able to make that up through other cargoes. Cement came back for the first time in several years. They also have some other dry bulk products that have been added to the cargo for this year. So all in all, we actually saw a cargo revenue share where we didn't really expect to this year, so that was good news. Because of that and other factors mainly having to do with Rick's work on acquiring new lease revenue, we were able to turn a profit for the third year in a row, and that's inclusive of debt service and all other one-time expenses. So the port is profitable at this point, and as you'll see later, that trend hopefully will continue. We also finally were able to kind of crack the last nut of our operating expenses, which is insurance. We didn't get a huge reduction like we had hoped, but we were through, again, a lot of hard work by Rick to try to reevaluate our assets. We were able to reduce insurance costs quite a bit. One of the items you saw earlier in the year was Agrium, as you know, sold their facility to Yara International, and we renewed their lease. That lease alone is worth almost $1 million in terms of just the next 5 or 6 years. And then Lake Washington, we acquired another grant for cleanup, and that project is making a lot of progress towards removing barges from the lake to improve recreation. We had a big year real estate-wise in terms of property acquisitions, so we closed on the Stone Lock property, and then the other property, the 4300 West Capitol, which is planned for the city's Corporation yard. Those are both key acquisitions in terms of both current and future revenue potential. The 4300 West Capitol property alone, there were some existing tenants, but we've also added a bunch of other tenants out there, so it's a total of almost $185,000 over the next 2 years that we'll get from those sites. And then the site C that you have approved a improvement plan on at, I think, the last meeting, we have already secured lease revenue from UPS for sites B and C that far outpace what we're spending on the improvements, so that was another positive real estate development in the last year. So jumping right into our performance over the last year, revenue was just above $2.1 million, almost 95%, I believe, is from real estate leases on that. That's inclusive of the SSA lease. And then expenses were about on track for what we expected. Those are our operating expenses, so everything from personnel to the insurance. And so we were right about $1.7 million. That was very similar to last year's expense total and also what we're projecting for the coming year. So that's your operating profit. We were about at $416,000. That was up from our projection from this year, and again, that mainly had to do with the additional lease revenue we were able to obtain. So like I said, real estate was the vast majority of that total, a little over $2 million. Like I mentioned earlier, we did receive a share of cargo fees from SSA. I think that number is actually low. The staff report probably has the more accurate one, but it was higher than we anticipated, mainly having to do with SSA's ability to see cement come back and get a couple of other types of cargo in. And then the foreign trade zone revenue was higher than normal, but that's only because one of the payments was made either early or late, but it affected the numbers. So, but that number is usually about $19,000. So on the expense side, we have a little over $1 million in operating costs, and then debt service is almost $700,000. Basically same as last year, like I mentioned. And debt service is only going to go down from here because we have the Taylor Village debt that will be paid off, scheduled to be paid off this year, and that's a little over $300,000. So, so that expense number is only going to go down. That'll affect the operating profit going forward. So if you take the operating profit from 15-16, we had one-time revenue from a rebate that we received, and then we had one-time expenses that included the Site C improvements. Then this is projecting through the end of June. We're going to spend about $185,000 on that through the end of the fiscal year. We have to match the Lake Washington cleanup grant, and then we did have some expenses related to the acquisition of 4300 West Capitol and Stone Lock. But even with the one-time expenses, we had a $200,000 net surplus for fiscal year 15-16. We carried over almost $1.1 million, so our year-end balance, we're projecting about $1.3 million to finish this fiscal year. So now getting into the proposed budget for fiscal year 16-17, revenue is going to be very much the same as this year. All the leases that we had this year, none of them are expiring, I believe, next year. We may even pick up a couple more, so hopefully that number will be higher. And then, like I said, expenses are going to be about the same as they were this year. So we're projecting an operating profit of $280,000 for the coming fiscal year. And just to break that down in the same way. So real estate is going to be a little bit higher because of the 4300 West Capitol. We're projecting, as we usually do this time of year, a flat, conservative amount for the cargo and vessel fees, just not knowing what the cargo market will bring, not being in control of that. And then the same goes for the vessel fees. We only get a portion of what SSA collects. So that number could be higher. We hope it's always higher, but it's never going to be less than zero. So that's the whole benefit of the SSA lease. And then the foreign trade zone, we're anticipating that one of those will drop off, so the revenue is going to be about 6,000 less. So the total revenue, again, is about 2.1 million. Operating costs, these are detailed in the staff report for the reasons why we're expecting them to be higher, but in general, we are a much larger property owner this time, or at this point, than we were a year ago. Stone Lock alone has quite a bit of management challenges. We have things like encampments that may pop up, weed abatement, things that we weren't in the business of last year, but it's just going to take some money to maintain that. So we wanted to budget for that, for those expenditures coming up. And then legal has also been a higher number than we anticipated. That's mainly to do with the amount of real estate acquisitions we're doing. So in a way, that's a kind of an investment in the future. And then on personnel, we are proposing that the position in the Economic Development Department that's currently a senior clerk be elevated to a secretary position. The port currently pays for that position, but it does offer some utility to both the Economic Development Department and the city manager's office, but that kind of is a two-way street. So the port, under this proposal, will continue to pay for that position. The net amount is roughly 10,000, but that wouldn't all be incurred this year. That's kind of the change in the range. So that number is accounted for in this total. And then debt service won't have any change. Like I mentioned, we're looking forward to getting rid of the Taylor Village payment this year, and that number will be more like 350, I believe, going forward. And that just includes the iBank payment and the repayments that are scheduled to the city for past general fund loans. So taking the revenue and expenses into account, operating profit, we're looking at about 335, where we have the one-time expense of 85,000, so that gets you to that number I showed earlier, 240 or whatever it was. And that's because of the Site C improvements. We're going to finish that project next fiscal year, and we'll carry over the 1.3 million. We hope to finish the year next year with about 1.5 million in cash. So that's the budget for next year. And then looking ahead 5 years, we always like to show you this, kind of looking at the foreseeable future. I want to point out this assumes that SSA will renew their lease. We'll talk a little bit about that in the next item, but assuming that is the case, we're showing an operating profit going forward, pretty healthy outlook. The only thing I'll note here is on real estate revenue, you'll notice a pretty sharp decline in year 3, and that really has to do with a lot of the leases we initiated a few years ago were short-term, and it was by design, because we didn't really know where we'd be in 5 years. But given that those are expiring, a lot of those tenants like being where they are. They may be interested in renewing. We hope that real estate number is going to be closer to 2 million as we go forward. And on the expense side, it's pretty stable. We don't see a lot of, at least on the operating side, a lot of changes there. We could have more one-time expenses depending on what happens maintenance-wise. And like I said, land management costs are a little unpredictable, but all in all, it's a pretty good outlook. The numbers we really want to focus on are that operating profit and the year-end balance going forward. So that's the budget proposal for fiscal year 16, 17. And Rick and I are available if you have any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Laurel. Are there any questions? Commissioner Sandine.
Thank you, Mr. Laurel. Quick question about the operating expenses in the budget projection for next year. You mentioned the cost of land management, and I'm trying to find that on the budget. Is that the landscaping and maintenance figure that's adding to the, or what? I'm just trying to get.
Yeah. Let me.
I just want to make sure we have enough in the budget that it seems like if that cost is going up, I've not seen that landscape maintenance reflected. If we're spending 42,000 this year and then the budget's 40,000, but we may have more expense, I'd just rather see that be
Right.
possibly higher as an expense line.
Right, it's a little bit of a labeling issue here,
Okay.
but we have a category that's the third line down, landscaping and maintenance. So
Right.
that includes the base costs from what we've experienced in the past. Then the last line item is land management / pre-development costs. We
Okay.
added 15,000 to account mainly for what we've been experiencing as of late regarding weed abatement and cleanup costs.
Do those need to be higher, though? I mean,
It
that's.
could be higher.
That would be my only
Yeah.
suggestion in terms of kind of hearing what you're saying in terms of the needs and then seeing the figures. So it just seems to me that those two lines could bump up a little bit so
Right.
that we're adequately, there's the budget there to actually do those things and that you're not having to come back or,
Yeah.
something.
We'll take a closer look at what we've been accumulating so far and try to create a more of a pad there for those costs. I think it could be higher.
Okay, I really appreciate the work that's been done, close management of the expenses and then boosting the revenue, so I'm happy with the proposal. I just want to make sure that if there's a need to be higher, it's
Right.
okay to go higher, from my perspective.
Right.
Yeah, just a couple quick questions. So I know we're going to talk about the master lease of the North Terminal and just, if that's going to be extended or not. But I think what this budget does reflect is that we're diversified, but not really diversified. It's about a third of the revenue. It looks like it's in that one activity. Would it be beneficial to pull out just that activity and the related expenses? I know there's a lot of staff time that may be kind of overhead for the entire operation, but kind of see what it would be like if we lost that today, what this would look like.
Yeah, we do have a budget model that shows that, and to give you some assurance on that, given that we have early indication that SSA is interested in extending, I'll just say that to start. But not knowing if that's gonna come to fruition, we're not sitting around waiting for that. We're kind of looking at, okay, if this happened, what will we do? And at that point, it really does become an exercise of how can we position the remainder of the property on the North Terminal to create more lease opportunities. And we think there's some opportunity there, so we are doing some preliminary analysis on that as sort of a backup plan. But all indications are right now that SSA is interested in renewing. Now, in terms of the actual expenses that go with the SSA lease, I would almost say, and Rick can give his opinion, that most of our costs, the time that gets taken up, has to do with the other leases, because there's a lot of lease management with the smaller tenants. With SSA, Rick does attend regular meetings, and we track ships and a lot of the things that we were doing already. So we could try to break that out and sort of do a net analysis of what that lease means to us, and then compare that to what it would be if we didn't have that lease, so.
Yeah, I mean, it's, at this point, we're still a number of years before the end of the lease, and so it's not real critical, but, in terms of planning, the what-if situations. And that kind of gets onto the foreign trade zones. Is there much work that goes into that, or is it more just? So I know we talked about in the past about expansion of foreign trade zone. And it only is probably 6,000 or 7,000. It's not a whole lot to the bottom line here, but is that something that, when you're looking at diversifying, would there be much effort to expand the footprint of foreign trade zones?
Well, our experience has been that there's limited upside there. It's a tool that appeals to large importers, and in the past, the port has tried to market that license, that sub-license ability through the regional economic development organizations with limited success. So I don't see a lot of upside there. It's really just the big importers tend to find us, and we've been fairly stable with 3 or 4 of them for several years. But there's minimal upside there, in my opinion.
All right, so it sounds like really the fallback is really just if the master lease goes away, to work on leasing, getting new lease activities within that property.
Right, and on that point, I would just add too that SSA pays a lot of the expenses. It's essentially a triple net lease. So there would be additional expenses that we would pick up, security and utilities, for example, if they pull out. So we can look at the budget model with increased expenses as well.
Yeah, all right, thanks.
Any other questions? Commissioners, no? All right, so the staff's looking for us to approve this budget.
I'll second.
Motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Motion carries unanimously. Item 4 is presentation of the port work plan. Again, Mr. Laurel.
Okay, while Teresa's pulling this up, I'll, just by way of introduction, we did the business plan back in 2013. It was almost 3 years ago to the date. And so we've gone through the business plan, done an analysis kind of every year on where we're at, and we're sort of at the point where we've implemented almost everything we said we were going to, and even the things that are sort of ongoing, it's kind of at the point where it made more sense to look at the port as kind of an annual work plan rather than just referring to the business plan. So that's where this came from. Port CEO thought it'd be a good idea to bring this to the commission as an annual thing, so that's what we're going to start to do, and it made sense also to time it with the budget. So this is really our annual game plan, and it may seem ambitious, I'll be the first to say that, but we are doing a lot of these things already, and these are things that are in the works, so we think it's a manageable plan for this year. So it's divided into 4 categories. Rick and I are actually going to team the presentation here, but there's operations management, real estate, capital projects, and then other categories. So Rick can start off on the operations.
Sure, I'll just go through these quickly. We are up to 34 tenants in terms of our tenant portfolio. 7 of those are at the 4300 West Capitol Avenue site, and we will be looking to terminate those leases ultimately when the city initiates its Corporate project there. So going forward, we are fully leased at the North Terminal. I anticipate that most of our work there will be related to actually giving notice to 7 existing tenants that they'll have to vacate, and that'll be in the late 17, early 18 timeframe, based on the Corporate project. The rail project contracts, as you know, we have the operating agreement with Sierra Northern Railroad and the canal agreement with UP. Going forward in the near term, the Sierra Northern property that we sold them several years ago, they've had it for sale. We have an option to buy that back. I think that you're going to see us coming to you with, based on some action from Sierra Northern or some request from Sierra Northern relative to that property, and that will naturally tie in their operating agreement. So no updates there. Other rail related activities, we're monitoring rail activity, participating in the Yolo regional effort, and more about that in our later in the presentation. Cargo tracking, Aaron mentioned, cargo is up 35%. We're at 420,000 tons this fiscal year, and that is despite a drop-off in rice, and that is because of a large increase in cement. And there's one cargo that SSA has been very successful bringing in this year. It's feed grain. It's, in my opinion, it's kind of an anomaly, an economic anomaly. It's coming from Turkey. It's coming halfway around the world, and it's animal feed. So I don't see that as being sustainable. And we've seen that cargo come and go over the years. So we're a bit concerned about rice and Stockton's aggressive pricing on rice, and we'll be watching that carefully this coming fiscal year. Groundwater management is handled primarily through a contract with Wallace Cool. That stems from legacy contamination from fertilizer operations. And a couple of related projects to that in our capital expenditure section, which we'll get to later in the presentation. And North Terminal maintenance, primarily landscaping and underground infrastructure, plumbing and electrical. We've been lucky on that, knock on wood. We are vulnerable to an upset there, so that I would say is one of our major vulnerabilities going forward, but so far so good on that. And financial management, you just heard Aaron's presentation. I think the major issue for us going forward is whether SSA is going to renew their lease or not. We do have an indication from them, although they haven't committed to it, that they will extend for 5 years. So I'll continue to press for an answer there. And we have an outstanding issue on the Longshore complaint with PERB related to the log yard that we'll be monitoring, that will possibly have an impact next year. And I think going forward, financially, a lot more attention will be, a lot more of our finances will be related to our non-maritime real estate activities for Stone Lock. So I see that as taking on a larger role than it has been historically.
And that's a good segue to real estate activities. We are a lot more active than we were in the past in terms of not just leasing property, but also acquiring property and working through the city to start to sort of master plan some of those sites to get them ready for eventual development. So Stone Lock is the best example of that. We are currently engaged, because our department is one and the same, doing the work on the Pioneer Bluff/Stone Lock master planning. So we're already getting quite a bit of interest on the Stone Lock property, but we do think it's prudent to participate with the city in that process and get the master plan in place, get the infrastructure done on Village Parkway before we start to entertain proposals. There is one exception to that, and I'll finish off on that project. The North Terminal, the main issue here, and I know as council members you've had some insight to this too, is we're keenly interested in what happens with the city's long-term flood protection plan for the port. We would like to see a scenario from staff's perspective that avoids putting a flood wall down Industrial Boulevard and keeps the port North Terminal developable. So we're coordinating with the flood program on that. There'll be probably a little bit of work on that this year. Possibly also looking at revisiting the Newport entrance as a way of making the boat club entrance safer. So we'll be exploring funding for that. On Seaway, you pretty well know what's going on there, waiting on the general plan update. We've done the final map and the wetlands delineation, and we're also getting, from time to time, inquiries from developers on that property as well. In Pioneer Bluff, you heard last year we were looking at a couple of acquisitions. We anticipate maybe some developments coming forward on those this year, so we'll bring those back when they occur. 4300 West Capitol will eventually be done as a deal with the city on the courtyard. We're not sure exactly how that's going to play out in terms of the long-term ownership of that property, but this year we'll be making a lot of progress with the city on the courtyard. And we'll also be hoping to initiate negotiations with DWR for the rest of the property. We know they're interested in other property that we have in the Delta, and there may be a mutual interest there. The Deepwater Channel excess properties is something that may be new to the commission, because it's we're sort of working on it at the beginning stage right now. But we've discovered we have a strip of land that follows the channel but backs into properties in Southport Industrial Park. It's unusable space for us, but it's potentially valuable space for the adjacent property owners to increase yard space, which most of those are big trucking operations. So our plan is to get surveys done for individual properties and then go to those landowners and talk to them about potentially buying the excess property. It could mean a good amount of revenue for the port for property that we really can't use. So we're looking into that. And then lastly, we're working on an RFP for the Barge Canal property we're calling a Stone Lock Phase 1. So that's just the property that's west of Jefferson, but in between the Palmadesi Bridge. We have a couple of recreation uses planned there as well, but the plan right now is to finish a water model that will tell us whether or not the city has capacity to actually develop that site. And then we're going to do an RFP and hopefully get into developer selection and actually sell that property. The timing we're a little unsure of, but next fiscal year could be realistic. So.
There we go. Moving on to capital projects. The Lake Washington Cleanup Project just submitted a grant application to Boating and Waterways last week, and they have been happy with our cleanup with the first 2 rounds of funding, so I have my fingers crossed for an additional grant award to keep that project going. Site C improvements should get underway as early as next week. That's the UPS expansion site. We bid out grading and graveling of that, and the contractor should be getting underway very soon. Yolo Regional Rail, you heard the presentation on that, the economic findings at the last meeting. The next phase for us really is funding additional analysis, and given that West Sacramento has the most at stake here, the partners are looking to us to shoulder grant management and putting equity into, putting cash into additional study. So we're looking at doing a joint CIP with the city to fund additional work there. And then the last two, D building demolition and E building roof replacement, are related. Those buildings are connected by a canopy. D building is really unsafe and should be demolished. SSA has been bidding that out. Unfortunately, the price of scrap metal has really gone down, so what we hoped was a self-financing project is no longer that. And I put this really as related to whether or not SSA extends their lease for 5 years. So we'll be negotiating the demolition of that building in relation to extending their lease, and then also, as part of that, doing some roofing improvements on E building.
And the only thing I'd add on, going back to the Yolo Regional Rail project, if the port / city consider, putting additional funding in for future feasibility studies, it would be focused on the West Sacramento portions of that project. Could also be leveraged with regional funds or maybe more EDA money to support the regional effort, but I just want to point out that that's kind of the way we're approaching it, would be for the benefit of determining feasibility of the portions affecting West Sacramento, first and foremost. And lastly, the last item we just classified under other is what we had a workshop on a few months ago on the joint port governance agreement, reforms, amendments, or rescinding that agreement. We're working on a task that was tougher than we first anticipated, which is really to truly compile all the costs the city has incurred to support the port, and that will help us initiate the discussions with the other parties related to the governance agreement. So that's the work plan we're proposing. In the staff report, there's a more detailed version. It actually includes bullet points of tasks that we plan to undertake during the upcoming fiscal year. But I don't anticipate that list changing much from even next fiscal year to the following one. We think it's a pretty good game plan, because it's already sort of what we're working on now. But we'll continue to update it and bring it back to the commission on an annual basis. So, thank you.
Thank you for the report. And for all those watching, Chair Villegas needed to excuse himself, so I'll be chairing the rest of the meeting. So any questions? Mr. Cabaldon, Commissioner Cabaldon.
Thank you. First, both this item and the budget I thought were extraordinarily clear and helpful, and worked well together, and in giving us a good picture of the program of work in a very comprehensive way and very understandable. So I really appreciated both of them. The work plan, I think, does capture the key priorities and projects that the commission's identified. Just two comments about it. One is, at least for me, the Barge Canal Stone Lac Phase 1 project is not among the top priorities on the list. I'm supportive of working on it, but for me at least, it's not the number one. And I know how bright, shiny objects like this can draw attention. But when we made the push to take primary responsibility for the port through the city, one of the central objectives and one of the central reasons that we gave, in addition to the fact that it was going to disappear and go bankrupt and fall apart without us, was that we were going to be better stewards of the recreation mission of the port than the region had been when the region was running it. And as part of that effort, our very first play out of the gate was to create the Barge Canal Access, which has been, for me at least, a very surprisingly successful and low-cost operation. And so whatever we move forward in that area, we need to be attentive. We can't be in any way reducing the overall amount of recreational opportunity that's available to the Port District. And so that's not the same thing as the Arlington Oaks Neighborhood Park. The sort of what is the overall recreation contribution of the port beyond the private clubs that only, a limited number of people can participate in. That's the one facility that we have. And so I'm supportive of moving forward with this, but I don't want it to become the thing that is driving the staff's work plan, and finding a housing development project to put in that piece of property is, at least for me, not the highest priority, as opposed to getting the SSA contract done and some of their real estate projects that are absolutely necessary, and finishing of the Yolo project and some of the capital projects. Then on the governance agreement piece, it seems to me like we also should be examining whether or not the underlying statute ought to be modernized as well. I mean, we're living with a state law that created the Port District in a particular way. We made just the amendments that we had to make, a decade ago, or however long it's been now since we did this agreement. We did just what we had to, because the legislature was so reluctant to do the change at all. So we've never gone through and said, okay, if we were to write the statute from scratch, recognizing what the facts on the ground are right now in terms of the city's de facto control and operation of the port, might we do it differently? I mean, what does the Oakland statute look like, or the Stockton statute, or the LA or Long Beach statutes? And if there was a time to do that, it seems like the best moment would be while Senator Wolk was still here. I think for me, the balance on this item is getting the information all perfect, which sounds like it's been a challenge. Getting all the information in order to make the best case possible isn't necessarily would not be as tactically smart as getting it done, as just going with what we have, while we still have one of the legislators that sees this as their baby still in office. Because we have to go and make the case, and then it's a battle over whose story is right. Because remember, the mayor of Sacramento, we've already been through, it's a different one than was around during this period. I think now the entire Board of Supervisors, except for Don Natoli, is different than was there back then. So, any links to what was intended, and the underlying, trust and expectations of that agreement I think will be as important as the facts, around who spent what. Well, not who. I mean, we spent it all. So, but I mean, so moving on this quickly, and potentially looking at some statutory changes. But even if we don't have statutory changes, making sure Senator Wolk is involved in that process while she's still here. And we only have until November until that opportunity is gone. So I would suggest putting a little bit more priority on this item, even though it's not as urgent, but because the range of possibilities for us to help resolve it may diminish after November.
Okay, and on that point, we did identify in the code which sections would be ideal to change and how we would want to change them when we did the initial work, so we can maybe sort of flip those two on in terms of how we approach the overall governance agreement issue. Because the legislation, honestly, is where the bigger problems are, so it might make more sense to approach it that way.
Yeah, if the Senator Wolk was carrying something as a cleanup to the legislation that she and Senator Machado did, it's just a lot simpler than us Richard Pan having to pretend that he knows anything about this whole history and the whole project. So it's just we would have a much stronger case legislatively if we acted while that original author is still here.
All right, thank you, Commissioner Kowaldman. Commissioner, nothing? All right, alternate member
A couple
Christoph.
things. I think Commissioner Kowaldman's right on. I think we do need to focus a little bit more on this agreement. And when you talk about the governance agreement, are you talking about Sac County being involved?
Yeah, so the workshop that we did identified all the issues that have been problematic for us with the governance agreement. So part of it is needing consents on certain things, real estate related. There's some other more detailed provisions that have proven to be an issue for us. But the legislation, like I mentioned, has some of the most problematic effects on our seaway property. So it's sort of both.
Yeah, and I'm worried about that. I worry about that because, quite frankly, I don't think Sac County deserves any part of any upside that we may get. So I would like to see if there's a way to tweak that legislation as Commissioner Caballan has stated. The other thing is on the Yolo Regional Rail Project, where would you anticipate getting additional funding for that without it coming out of the city general fund or the city finances, so to speak?
Well, our approach locally anyway would be for the West Sacramento portions of the project, we would look as a partnership between the port and the city because it does have quite a bit of an effect on port real estate as well.
Mm-hmm.
So we could foresee bringing back a proposal to allocate some port funds, and I could also on the city side see it, being
Are
presented
there
as a
any
priority
monies
for-
available that are not port monies or city monies?
So that would be more EDA money. The EDA grant that we had originally funded the study. We could go back to EDA for additional funding for the next phases of it, but you do have to, leverage that money. So I think there would still be some portion that would be from the city and port, but we just haven't gotten to that stage yet to even know how much that cost is. Yeah.
So, and in the regional group, we have our partners. SAFCA has indicated a willingness to contribute some funds. Yolo County, our chairman has left, but Yolo County is a maybe. City of Woodland is a maybe. Davis is probably a no. So there's a little money from our partner jurisdictions.
Okay. Does the port still owe the city monies? I mean, is that the $695,000 that I saw in the budget?
No, the port owes the city, I believe the total at this point is in the order of 3.7 million.
Okay.
So that the numbers there are 1.6 million from, it was redevelopment related. There was a
Right.
clawback the city
Right.
paid on behalf of the port. The rest is the Stone Lock transaction.
Okay.
The city essentially financed that
Right.
acquisition for the port.
And how do you, I didn't see that in the budget on how you propose repaying that.
So the general fund side, the 1.6 million, and there was a little bit of a general fund loan there as well, has an annual debt service payment to the
Okay.
city. So we've been making those payments. The Stone Lock side of that is to be repaid when the property sells.
Right.
There's a repayment to the city. Yeah, and we also have the Courtyard site at 4300 West Capitol. So we've been, we kind of handle both sides of the balance sheet there. So we've been looking at that in terms of a plan going forward of how the port can make the city whole, maybe
Okay.
not just through cash repayment, but there's property that the city needs from the port as
Okay.
well.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions or comments? I do think this is a very comprehensive and, I want to say ambitious, but there's a lot in this work plan, and I think you received some excellent suggestions in terms of prioritization, because all these can't exactly have the same priority to move them forward. So I think you've heard that from the commission. And with that, I'll entertain a motion. Moved by Commissioner Cabaldan,
Second.
seconded by alternate member Christoph. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. It passes unanimously. That brings us to commissioner reports. Are there any reports from the commissioners? No reports? The Port CEO report.
Just briefly, I was going to add on to Rick and Aaron's presentation. I mean, this represents the biggest profit that the port's demonstrated since the city has taken over. We've asked, what's the history of the port's profit, and we couldn't get that. But we're certainly moving out of the red with a very, very small but very talented staff. Aaron, Rick, a city attorney, kicks in as well as city staff on different tasks. So it's really a pleasure to see how this has evolved. And I think the discussion we had this evening on our priorities is helpful. We're going to pursue the The SSA extension, I think there's an opportunity to give us more. Again, it was 30% of our revenue. We ought to take that. If for some reason they wanted to back out, I don't think it would be the end of the world. This area is shown to be very, very strong from logistics, and Rick's been able to lease out really every square inch of the port around the terminal. Site C is the parcel directly across the street from Farmer's Rice. It's where we had the mound of dirt. Rick was very creative in terms of getting that soil removed, getting it ready. So it made big strides. So even if Maritime were to end today, that location is really superb from logistics, and we're seeing it. Been very successful in lining up these short-term leases, but I think it wouldn't take a whole big effort to make those longer term as well. So good direction, particularly on the governance item. And on the barge canal access area, we get it. We're talking to UC Davis and the boat clubs about the possibility of moving them closer to Jefferson. So anything we bring back in terms of that RFP, that we would include a huge recreation component to it. We get it, that we don't want to simply sell it for high-density housing and compete with the Bridge District and other areas for that. So I think the direction we got was superb, and appreciate it a lot.
Great, thank you very much. All right, that brings us to the end of the meeting. Oh, yes.
He didn't mention it,
Commissioner
but
Capone.
tomorrow we're hosting what's the name of it? The Global Food Industry Trade Forum. The city is. I'm sure the port's a co-host of this event, which is so I know several members of the commission are going to be in attendance, as well as many of the key industry leaders from the city in this domain. But one of the key leaders in the U.S. Trade Representative Office is going to be joining us as one of the featured speakers of the day. So it should be a good session.
And the new head of SSA, for at least for the port, Jeff Stiles, will be there as well. So there is a port angle.
Great. Thank you for that. Is there a motion to adjourn? Oh, moved by Commissioner Cabaldon, seconded by, was that you? Oh, Mr. Jennison. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Meeting's adjourned. Thank you.